Hey, welcome to my channel, Hey Hayden TV. I'm Hayden. Have you ever wanted to take a deep dive into the history of video gaming? How it started, why it started, when it started, what the first video game ever was? No, you haven't? Okay, well, I'm gonna tell you anyway. It's most commonly believed that the first video game ever made was Pong. And while Pong most certainly was one of the first games ever on a mass scale, released to a mass audience, it absolutely was not the first one ever. In fact, it wasn't even really close. Games can actually be traced back a whopping 25 years before Pong was ever even an idea. But before we get any further, if you want to see more content of a brilliant, genius, dashing man giving fantastic takes in the gaming sphere, go ahead and close this video and find someone else, because that's not me. But if you want to see some dumbass making fun of people, say dumb shit, funny shit, troll a lot of people, talk about video games, that's me. I'm that guy. Hit that like button, hit subscribe, bell button, do all that shit so I pop back up on your feed again. I'm that idiot that you want to watch. So we've established Pong wasn't the first game ever. Well then, what was? Most people that know Pong did not come first might say, it wasn't Pong, it was Computer Space. Or they'll say, it was Space Wars. Both of these did release before Pong, you're absolutely correct, yet still neither are actually the first. So what the hell was the first one then? Well, before we get to that, there's a lot we have to talk about. There's a long list of things that need to be covered before. I can't really just simply answer this question. It's incredibly complex. There are a lot of details we have to go over. It's such a complex question that I have.
Oh my god, just fucking tell us already.
I mean, I don't know why I gotta be so rude about it. But fine. Here's the first ever video game made and when it first came out. Games can be traced all the way back to the 1940s, beginning specifically in 1947 with the creation of the cathode ray tube amusement device. Cathode ray tube, of course, being what you know as CRT. In other words, they've effectively named this game Fun Game TV Screen. Absolutely brilliant. Genius shit right there. This game was displayed by connecting a cathode ray tube to an oscilloscope, and it simulated artillery shells arcing towards targets, which were targeted by the player adjusting knobs to change the trajectory. Two physicists by the last names of Goldsmith Jr. and Mann created and patented the device in 1947. It was never manufactured, it was never in the public, and it had absolutely no effect on the video game industry whatsoever. But it did exist. People made it, people played it. Well, a couple people played it. It was a game played on a video screen, goddammit, thus absolutely qualifying as the first ever video game.
Hey Hayden, the cathode ray tube amusement device was built on analog hardware and wasn't computerized. I don't think that counts as a video game.
Okay, fine. Sure, you could be a cheeky bastard, and you could say that. But to that I say don't. Just don't. Don't be a cheeky bastard. That's not necessary. It broadcast moving images on the screen, i.e. video. And it was a game, ergo video game. You got it. Alright, but like semantics aside, the game was created because the two physicists were inspired by radar technology used during World War II. Goldsmith Jr. was working at Dumont Laboratories at the time, and it is believed he created the prototype not for it to be a part of any future production, but merely as a demonstration of the kind of commercial opportunities that Dumont would be able to pursue in the future.
Well, I think you're reaching a little hard trying to call that a video game. It don't count. A video game needs to be computerized to count.
Oh God, fine. Fine, if you want to continue being a cheeky bastard and argue simply for the sake of argument, I will concede that the CRT amusement device wasn't a video game. You know, even though By definition of each of those words, obviously it would be. But fine, it's not a video game. Well then, let's move on to what would be the first ever video game. And by that I mean the first ever video game made after the first ever video game that we aren't calling a video game because some hot chick doesn't think it meets these standards adequately enough. Well, that takes us to the 1950s then. The 1950s is where we will find the first video games that were actually computerized. So if you were playing the Cheeky Bastard game and not counting the CRT Fun Game thing, because it was built entirely on analog hardware, you best sit your ass down now because we're getting fucking computerized. Oh, the first ever video game made after the first ever video game was a game of tic-tac-toe. And it was played on a machine called Bertie the Brain. Bertie the Brain was a 13-foot tall computer built by Dr. Joseph Cates for the Canadian National Exhibition in 1950. I'm not going to describe how this game was played because if you don't know what tic-tac-toe is, I mean, what the fuck? It's tic-tac-fucking-toe. Or knots and crosses, whatever you English weirdos call it. Anyway, Dr. Joseph Cates created the game as a means to showcase his Additron tube. Now this was a miniature version of a vacuum tube. Basically, some shit that was a key component of electrical circuits in the early 20th century. Unfortunately for Dr. Cates, this creation was pretty much dead on arrival as the transistor showed up right around that time as well, which effectively did the same shit, only with significantly less power consumption, was smaller, less heat, and exponentially increased efficiency. So the Additron tube was out. Who gives a fuck about that? We're talking about video games. Bertie the Brain had a 9-button panel in front of the screen for the player to input his X or O, and the machine also had a means of increasing or decreasing the difficulty. Supposedly, the computer's difficulty could be increased so high it was effectively unbeatable. I wasn't there, I don't know if that's true, but I'd wager that's probably be true because we're talking about tic-tac-toe. So there we have it. Bertie the goddamn Brain, the first computerized video game ever made.
Hey Hayden, I don't think that counts either. Technically, it's not broadcasting moving images, so there's no video. A video by definition is the recording, reproducing, or broadcasting of moving visual images, or a recording of moving visual images made digitally or on videotape. Bertie the Brain has no moving images, so there's no video. If there's no video, it can't be a video game.
You bitch. Fine, let's pause there for a moment. And let's head on over to the Oxford Languages Dictionary. And why don't we go ahead and look up video game. Here we go. Video game. A game played by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program on a television screen or other display screen. Technically, it doesn't say the images need to be moving, simply manipulated for it to be a video game, which we are doing here. It does, however, say produced by a computer program, thus disqualifying our cathode ray tube and amusement game screen playful device thing, whatever the fuck they call that. So maybe I'll concede that that thing wasn't officially the first video game. It was still an electronic game played that was broadcasting through video. But if Oxford Languages wants to be picky, fine. And you know what? I'll go even further. Even though Oxford Languages doesn't explicitly say moving images, fine, we won't count Big Bitch Bertie either. Mainly because I don't want to argue with them titties. But fine, that's still not our first video game ever. So then what the hell would be the first video game? Well, this one. This one will win, I am sure of it. So let's move on down to 1952. In 1952, a man by the name of Alexander Sandy Douglas created a game called OXO. Now, there is some debate regarding whether or not OXO came out before a checkers video game created by Christopher Strachey. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Strachey's game came out in the summer of 1952, but no one seemed to know exactly when in 1952 OXO came out. But most impressions seem to be that it was before the checkers. So we're going to pretend like that's true. So we're sticking with OXO. That came first.
But Hayden, OXO is just another game of tic-tac-toe. We already said that doesn't count because there's no moving images.
Quite true. You are correct. We did say that. But let's go ahead and take a look at the screen here. This is OXO. You see that clock? It's moving.
Gotcha, bitch!
Not only do we electronically manipulate the letters on the screen, there is quite literally a moving image on the electronic screen, i.e. video, and it is a game, so it's a fucking video game, goddammit. Yup. So what exactly is OXO? Well, as Hey Lady previously mentioned in her attempt to derail my video, yes, it is another game of tic-tac-toe. Sandy Douglas programmed OXO for his thesis while attending the University of Cambridge. His thesis being on human-computer interaction. OXO was actually written for the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, EDSAC computer, a computer built in Cambridge in the late 1940s. Now, this computer was one of the very first store program computers that had read and writable memory. So that's some pretty damn fancy shit for the 1940s, if I say so myself. And indeed, I do say so myself. Sandy Douglas did technically not ever give the game the name other than just Noughts and Crosses. He never actually officially named it. Noughts and Crosses is what you fucking weirdos back then called it. It's just tic-tac-toe. The name OXO actually showed up a few decades later after a computer historian by the name of Martin Campbell Kelly. He had created a simulation file with the file name being OXO. So people today have kind of just since settled on calling it the game OXO, but it was never officially named that. Just throwing that out there. Much like the prior two games listed, OXO was never actually released to the public, and it was quickly abandoned after serving its initial purpose. And much like Big Bitch Birdie before, the game was played against an artificial intelligence of sorts and not another player. Instead of having a 9-button panel in front of you like Birdie, the player input their selection on one of the 9 dials on a rotary phone. I don't know, I guess he thought that was clever or something. I don't know. Honorable mentions. And honorable mention number 1 would be 1948's Turo Champ. Now this is an interesting one. Turo Champ was actually the first computerized game to ever go into development starting in 1948. And it was developed by Alan Turing and David Champernowne. If that first name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard the story about a computer scientist creating one of the first computers ever to crack German military codes and kill some motherfucking Nazis. Yep, we're talking about that Alan Turing. Turo Champ was a game of chess, but one where the computer would calculate every move either it or the opposing player could make, assign a point value to each game state, and then select the move with the highest assigned point value. This was 1948, however, so don't expect it to make any good moves. Apparently it played at such an incredibly low level that just about everyone with any sense could beat it. But again, we're talking about 1948 here, so that's freaking awesome. So if Turo Champ was created in 1948, why the hell is it just an honorable mention? It was computerized. So why is it not the first? Well, the game was never finished. Its algorithm was simply too complex for computers in the late 40s. And interestingly, it was actually initially designed to run on a computer called the Automatic Computing Engine, ACE, which just so happened to be another design by Alan Turing himself. Unfortunately, that computer was never completed either. That computer was initially built in 1945, technically never finished, but then in 1950 they did create a smaller version of it and call it the Pilot Ace. That one was finished and constructed for the National Physical Laboratory, which is a research and development laboratory in the UK. And despite development starting in 1948, it actually wasn't until 1952 where Turing finally was able to play a full game with the TuroChamp program. And he did so against another computer scientist by the name of Alec Glennie, where Turing actually had to execute every single step manually, so it never truly ran on its own. But here is where shit gets fucking weird, and it gets weird, and it gets a little gay, then it gets weird all over again. TuroChamp would never see the light of day. Ever. The project doesn't get continued, and the original program doesn't get preserved. Why? Well, Turing dies in 1954. But we're going to take a quick step back so you can find out why. In 1952, things get gay. Specifically in January of 1952, the 39-year-old Alan Turing would spark a relationship with a 19-year-old man by the name of Arnold Murray. Now you're probably asking, why is his gayness even a story? Why do we give a fuck about his sexuality? Well, we don't. Not only do we not give a fuck about his sexuality, we don't give a fuck about yours. Or anyone else's sexuality in the history of the goddamn fucking universe. We don't care, get over yourself. But we're talking about the 1950s here, so stigmas are a little bit different back then, and so were laws. So in January of 1952, Turing and Murray would have their house robbed, but apparently by someone who was an acquaintance of Murray. Turing still decides to go to the police to report the crime. What happens? Well, Turing and Murray themselves get arrested. Their house gets robbed and they get arrested. Why? Well, because they're gay. Their relationship was made known, and being gay in the UK was not legal. Quite unfortunate. Turing would then enter a plea guilty on advice of his brother, and he was given two options: imprisonment or probation, with one major conditional. That conditional? Chemical castration. What's Turing do? Accepts the latter. For his very own brother's recommendations, Turing makes accommodations, fulfilling his castration probation obligations. God, I would be so good at gangster rap. Anyway, to finish the story as why this is relevant as far as TuroChamp goes, well, because in 1954, the now chemically nutless Turing, he would take his own life. And he would do so by consuming a fatal dose of cyanide. Quite sadly, this Nazi annihilator's first ever developed video game would never truly see the light of day. Let's not weep for this legendary man. Let's not weep for this man whose life was abruptly ended in the saddest of ways. Instead, let's remember this computer warrior, this Nazi destroyer, this game creator, this multifaceted hero for not only his accomplishments, but the lessons we can learn from his death. Let this tragic hero's death be a grave warning to us all. Let this tragic hero's death be a means to fight the evil virus corrupting the minds of many broken children today. This virus, this disease, is plaguing the Western Hemisphere. They tell you your testicles only exist in the mind. They tell you you can change your willy-nilly. They tell you some snips and zips, they won't harm your drip. They say your dong's too long. That's wrong. The fix? Get tits. This brilliant man didn't take his own life. His life was taken. It's time to take our lives back. Or I don't know, people just need to wake the fuck up. This will be the last one covered for the 1950s, and we are going to 1958, where William Higginbotham would create Tennis for Two. Now this game would be created on the Donner Model 30 analog computer. and it was set up for display at the Brookhaven National Laboratory's annual public exhibition. This was, of course, held in the city of Brookhaven, a small town roughly 60 miles east of New York City. Now, much like the cathode ray tube amusement device, Tennis for Two was also displayed on an oscilloscope. Now, you may not actually recognize the name Higginbotham, but it's a pretty important name, and I'm specifically blaming Christopher Nolan for that. Why? Well, because Willie Higgy just so happened to be one of the top physicists that worked on the Manhattan Project. In Nolan's defense, there were just under 200,000 people working on that shit, so Willie Higgy's part probably didn't need an appearance in Oppenheimer. Higgy, we're calling him, if you've not noticed, Higgy's team developed electronics for the first atomic bomb. This included not only the bomb's ignition mechanism, but measuring instruments for the device itself as well. He also worked on creating radar display for an experimental aircraft called the B-28 bomber. So clearly this man had some freaking range. Just to set up a little background, in 1947, Higgy would take a job at the brand newly established Brookhaven National Laboratory, where they would focus on peaceful uses of atomic weapons. Once a year, the laboratory would set up an exhibition for the public, and this exhibition was mostly just touring through static displays, but there were some attempts to have interactive displays as well. Because of this, Higgy decided to create something that the visitors would find entertaining, and while reading the manual for the Donner Model 30 analog computer, he discovered the computer could calculate missile trajectories, or even bouncing balls affected by wind resistance. This information directly led him to building the foundation of the game Tennis for Two. As mentioned earlier, Tennis for Two was displayed on an oscilloscope. The game simulated a ball bouncing on a two-dimensional tennis court. The computer had two aluminum controllers, and each consisted of only a single button and a knob. To hit the ball, simply press the button. To change the angle of the shot, turn the knob. And since it was simulating tennis, you of course needed to hit the ball over the net. Groundbreaking stuff. A year after creating Tennis for Two, Higginbotham would create an upgraded version of the game. This would be 1959, of course, and the oscilloscope used had a larger screen, and the game even had multiple levels of gravity. You could simulate gravity levels of the moon and even Jupiter. Higginbotham's game-creating legacy would sadly fade into obscurity over the next couple decades, as Tennis for Two was effectively dissolved and forgotten within just a couple years. However, he would later make an appearance testifying in court during a series of lawsuits involving the first ever video game console. And that is where Pong will come into play. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode, let's call it. I'll be turning this into a series, releasing each new episode either once a week, every other week, kind of depending on the time it takes for me to make them. I'm doing this all myself, and I'm pretty incompetent, retarded, whatever you want to call it. But I'll do my best for a consistent release schedule. I will be covering gaming history in its entirety all the way up to today. And I'll be covering specific decades at a time, obviously in chronological order. Next episode, we're going to be moving on to the 60s and 70s, and hopefully you can count and, figure the rest out. It will be several episodes long, as the 90s and after, especially, the gaming world just becomes so expansive around then that it's probably going to take a lot to cover each one of those. I'll be covering everything from console wars to notable persons to games that change the landscape of game development, and basically just anything important to gaming. What I will not be covering, however, is gaming on mobile phones. Fuck that. I ain't wasting my breath talking about fucking gacha. I'm gonna say a lot of stupid shit. That's my thing. So if you want a fun history lesson about the world of gaming filled with lots of epic levels of stupidity, follow this channel. Bye.